Ford shut down an American factory in May 2025. Not for a strike, not for weak demand. It ran out of magnets, small magnets, the kind that move a seat, a wiper, a door. Ford's own spokesman confirmed the Chicago plant that builds the Explorer went dark for a week of American workers idle because of a licensing form in Beijing. And by late June, Ford's chief executive Jim Farley said it out loud at the Aspen Ideas Festival. His words, "We cannot get any high-powered magnets without China." He also said Ford had shut down plants for 3 straight weeks. Here's the question this video answers, and it is not the one you are expecting. If China could do that in 2025 with almost no warning, what exactly is stopping it from doing it again on November 10th, 2026? Because that date is not a guess. It is a deadline with a paper trail. And most Americans have never heard of it. Let us go back to what actually happened in order with names attached. On April 4th, 2025, China's Ministry of Commerce announced export controls on 7 rare earth elements: samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, yttrium. If those names mean nothing to you, that is the point. They are not consumer products. You cannot buy them at a hardware store. They are inputs. They sit inside things you already own and things the Pentagon already flies. And the timing was not subtle. It came 2 days after the tariff package the White House had branded as its big reciprocal move. Washington swung with tariffs, Beijing swung back with chemistry, and here is what made it clever rather than loud. China did not announce an embargo. An embargo is a headline. An embargo invites a response. Instead, Beijing announced a licensing regime. Exporters would now need permission. Paperwork, case-by-case approvals, timelines unspecified. On paper, nothing was banned. In practice, shipments stopped moving while the world waited for stamps. That is the part worth sitting with. The most effective economic weapon of 2025 was not a bomb or a blockade. It was a form that nobody was in a hurry to process. Now think about how quickly it landed. Tariffs take months to show up in your grocery bill. This took weeks to show up on an assembly line. Reuters reported in early June 2025 that automakers were facing shortages tied directly to the Chinese restrictions. Ford's Explorer line in Chicago went down in May. Suzuki suspended production of its Swift subcompact starting May 26th. European supplier plants and production lines went down too. Farley told Bloomberg on June 13th that the situation was, in his words, day-to-day and hand-to-mouth right now. That is a Fortune 500 chief executive describing his supply chain the way you would describe a bad week at a corner store. So ask yourself something uncomfortable. When was the last time an American administration was able to stop a Chinese factory in a month? Not tax it, not sanction its parent company, stop it. Because that asymmetry is the actual story here, and it did not go away when the headlines did. Which brings us to the part of the timeline that Washington prefers to talk about, because it sounds like a win. In May 2025, American and Chinese officials met in Geneva. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Trade Representative Jameson Greer sat down with Vice Premier He Lifeng. Out of Geneva came a de-escalation. The triple-digit tariff rates that had piled up in April came down sharply for a fixed window. Then came London in June, where the rare earth question moved from a side issue to the main table. On June 8th, China's Commerce Ministry said it would resume granting export permits for the restricted materials. Notice the verb, resume granting, not cancel, not remove. The valve was reopened by the same hand that had closed it, and the hand stayed on the valve. That is the detail almost every summary missed in the summer of 2025. The pipeline restarted, but the architecture stayed. And architecture is what matters when you are planning a factory 4 years out. Here's your next question, and hold on to it because the answer arrives later in this video, and it is not flattering to anybody in Washington. If the April controls were the leverage and the April controls were never actually withdrawn, then what exactly did the United States buy in Geneva? Before we answer that, October, because in October 2025, Beijing did something that told you how it reads its own position. On October 9th, China's Ministry of Commerce expanded the rare earth export regime again. Reuters reported that the expansion explicitly targeted defense and semiconductor end users. It added more elements to the list, and it reached across borders, with rules built around foreign-made products containing even trace amounts of Chinese origin rare earth material. That last piece is the one that made corporate lawyers in Germany, Japan, and Ohio sit up, because it was, structurally, the same extraterritorial logic the United States had spent years applying to advanced chips. Beijing had read America's playbook and rewritten it for magnets, and that is the context for the meeting everybody remembers. On October 30th, 2025, in Busan, South Korea, on the sidelines of the APEC gathering, Donald Trump met Xi Jinping face to face. The Brookings Institution put the meeting at roughly 100 minutes. 100 minutes, 2 men, 1 table, and a supply chain that touches every car, missile, wind turbine, and hard drive on the planet. What came out of Busan was a truce, a 1-year truce. And here I have to be careful with numbers, because this is exactly where a lot of commentary went sloppy. Wire services, including Reuters and Agence France-Presse, reported that American tariffs on Chinese goods came down from roughly 57% to roughly 47%, with the key move being a cut to the fentanyl-related tariff from 20% down to 10%. Other analyses describe the outcome differently, some pointing to a combined effective structure closer to 55% once every layer is stacked. And the credit insurer Coface described the fentanyl-linked cut as taking one headline rate from 41% to 31%. So which number is correct? The honest answer is that they are measuring different stacks. There is no single tariff on China. There are layers, exclusions, extensions, and suspensions sitting on top of each other. And the number you quote depends on which layers you count. Anyone who gives you one clean figure with total confidence is selling certainty they do not have. What is not ambiguous is what China gave in return. Beijing agreed to suspend for 1 year the sweeping controls it had announced on October 9th. And between November 7 and November 10, 2025, China's Ministry of Commerce published the actual notices making it official, covering the rare earth expansion, along with export controls on lithium battery materials and super hard materials, plus a separate notice on port fees. Bloomberg's coverage was blunt about the shape of it. China formalized the suspension of its sweeping controls until November 2026. The American side reciprocated with its own 1-year suspensions, including the 50% ownership rule for entity list affiliates and the port fees on Chinese vessels, and pushed certain tariff exclusion expirations out to November 10, 2026 as well. So everything got a 1-year clock. Everything. Which raises the obvious question that almost nobody asked out loud at the time. What happens on the day the clock stops? But first, the fine print. Because the fine print is the whole video. Reuters reported it plainly on October 30th. The pause covered the controls introduced on October 9th, and it appeared to leave in place the restrictions introduced in April, the ones covering those 7 rare earths, and critically, the finished magnets that automakers, defense contractors, and chip makers actually buy. Read that again. The measures that idled Ford's plants were the April measures. The April measures were not the ones suspended. What Beijing suspended was the escalation, not the leverage. That is why serious analysts refuse to call Busan a breakthrough. Coface titled its assessment of the deal as a tactical truce, not a strategic shift, not a peace treaty, not a reset. A pause in escalation, purchased for 12 months, on terms that left the underlying weapon loaded and holstered. And if you want to understand why the weapon still works, you have to understand what most people get wrong about rare earths. Ready for the part that changes how you read every headline on this subject? Rare earths are not rare. That is the naming accident at the center of this entire story. These 17 elements are scattered across the Earth's crust in reasonable quantities. There is rare earth ore in California at Mountain Pass. There is ore in Australia, in Brazil, in Canada, in Greenland, in Vietnam. Digging the rock out of the ground is not the bottleneck, and it never really was. The bottleneck is what happens after the rock. Separating these elements from each other is brutally difficult chemistry because they are stubbornly similar. It takes hundreds of stages of solvent extraction. It produces waste streams, including radioactive ones that require permits, storage, and a public willing to live near them. Then, after separation, you still have to turn oxides into metal, metal into alloy, alloy into sintered magnets with the exact coercivity a motor needs at high temperature. That is where dysprosium and terbium earn their place on Beijing's list. They are what keep a magnet from losing its strength when it gets hot, in an electric motor or a missile fin actuator or a fighter jet, and China owns that middle. Reuters, in November 2025, put it in one line. China produces over 90% of the world's processed rare earths and rare earth magnets. Over 90%. Not of the mining, of the processing and the magnets, so the United States can open every mine in Nevada tomorrow and still ship the concentrate to China to be turned into something useful. That is not a supply problem. That is a choke point, and it sits 3 steps downstream of where most politicians are looking. Here is the question that should keep a Pentagon planner awake. How many of those magnets go into a single American weapons platform? And what is the plan if the licenses stop on a Tuesday? The scale of the exposure is not a secret either. The Information Technology Industry Council, the trade group that represents much of the American tech sector, warned ahead of the Trump and Xi meeting that disruption in rare earth-dependent sectors could trigger $150 billion in global losses within a year. That figure is an industry estimate, not a measured outcome, and it should be read as such. But it tells you what the people who actually build things believed was at stake while the 2 presidents were scheduling their 100 minutes. Now, to be fair, the United States did not spend 2025 doing nothing. Washington moved, and it moved in a way that was genuinely unusual for a country that spent 40 years insisting markets should pick winners. In July 2025, the Department of Defense struck a deal with MP Materials, the operator of the Mountain Pass mine in California, that included a price floor for neodymium and praseodymium oxide, reported at $110 per kilogram, along with an equity stake that made the Pentagon the company's largest shareholder. Read the logic there. The government guaranteed a price because everyone involved understood the real risk. The real risk was never that America could not build a magnet plant. The real risk was that China could flood the market with cheap material the moment that plant opened and bankrupt it before it reached scale. That is not paranoia. That is the documented history of this industry, and it is why Mountain Pass has been opened, closed, and reopened across decades. Outside the United States, Australia's Lynas moved to separate heavy rare earths at commercial scale outside China. Japan, which learned this lesson early after its own rare earth confrontation with Beijing back in 2010, has spent 15 years building stockpiles and alternative suppliers, and even Japan is not free of the dependency. 15 years of deliberate effort by a wealthy, disciplined industrial state, and the answer is still not clean. Now ask how far the United States can get between now and November, because that is where we are. It is August 2026 as this is written, and the clock that started on November 10, 2025 has about 3 months left on it. Some accounts date the expiry to November 9th, others to November 10th, depending on which notice and which time zone you are reading. The difference is a rounding error. The substance is the same. The suspensions were written for 1 year, and 1 year is nearly up. And what has Washington said about extending it? Less than you would hope. Reuters reported in May 2026 that Treasury Secretary Bessent, speaking on the sidelines of a G7 finance meeting in Paris after a summit with Xi in Beijing, said the administration was, in his words, not in a rush to extend the truce. He said there was time to renew it in meetings later in the year. His assessment of the moment was 3 words: things are stable. He also argued that China had effectively gotten a deal on lower tariffs as a result of a Supreme Court decision that struck down the emergency tariff authority the administration had leaned on, and said he believed Beijing would accept the restoration of prior rates through other legal channels, as long as they did not go higher. So let us translate that from the language of finance ministers into English. The most powerful economy on Earth is going into the expiry of a critical minerals truce with a posture of relaxed confidence, a legal foundation for its own tariffs that a court has already narrowed, and a domestic magnet industry that is measured in single facilities rather than in supply chains. And on the other side, a government that has already demonstrated, with receipts, that it can idle Ford plants in under 60 days using nothing more aggressive than a licensing queue. Does that mean November brings a crisis? No, and anyone who tells you they know what happens is guessing. There is a perfectly plausible version where both sides quietly roll the suspensions forward, because both sides have reasons to. China's economy in 2026 is not looking for a fight with its largest customer, while domestic demand is soft. Beijing revealed its own unease about trade in its economic roadmap for the year, and the American side has an inflation problem that gets worse, not better, if magnets and battery materials get scarce heading into an election cycle. Stability is cheap right now for both governments. That is exactly why it exists. But here is the thing about a truce that expires. It does not just expire. It becomes a scheduled negotiation on a date everyone can see, with leverage that is measured in months of inventory. If you are a purchasing manager at an automaker or a defense supplier, you are not waiting for November to find out. You are building inventory now, or you are signing long-term contracts now, or you are explaining to your board why you did neither. Reuters reported in November 2025 that China had begun work on easing its rare earth export rules, including a move toward general licenses that the White House characterized as effectively broad approvals. But the reporting also noted it fell short of what Trump had suggested, and that Beijing said nothing publicly about rolling back the April controls at all. General licenses are better than case-by-case stamps. They are still licenses. They are still issued by a ministry. They can still be reviewed. So back to the question from the beginning. What did the United States actually buy? It bought time, and it paid for that time with tariff reductions. That is not nothing. Time is the only resource that builds a processing industry, and by every honest measure, America needs somewhere between 5 and 10 years of it, plus permits, plus a tolerance for industrial waste that no American county has volunteered for lately. What the United States did not buy is the thing everyone wanted to believe it bought. It did not buy the removal of the weapon. The April 2025 controls are the weapon. They are still on the books, and if you zoom out, this is the pattern that has defined every trade confrontation of the last decade, not just this one. Each side reaches for the tool where it is strong, and the other side is thin. The United States reaches for tariffs, financial access, and semiconductor equipment because it sits at the top of those systems. China reaches for processing, refining, and industrial inputs because it spent 30 years quietly buying the unglamorous middle of the supply chain while Western investors chase software margins. Nobody escalates into their own weakness. Everybody escalates into the other side's dependency. And then both sides sign a document with an expiry date on it and call it stability. That is what makes the rare earth episode of 2025 more instructive than the tariff numbers that dominated coverage. Tariffs are a tax, and a tax is a negotiation about price. A processing choke point is a switch, and a switch is a negotiation about whether you get to operate at all. Jim Farley's sentence from Aspen is the cleanest summary anyone in American industry has produced on the subject. We cannot get any high-powered magnets without China. He said that in June 2025 about seats and wipers and doors, not about anything exotic, about the parts of a car that a customer never thinks about until they stop working. So here is where we leave it, with 3 months on the clock. The truce is real, and it is written down, and it runs out in November 2026. Neither government has confirmed an extension. The American Treasury Secretary says there is no rush. Chinese officials have said the framework remains in effect. The April controls that actually stopped the factories were never lifted. The processing dominance that makes those controls bite has not meaningfully changed, and it will not change in a quarter. Somewhere in Washington and Beijing, teams are already drafting the terms of whatever comes next, and the rest of us will read about it in a press release after the fact. Watch the licensing data, not the speeches. Watch magnet export volumes, not the podium language about historic agreements. Watch whether general licenses stay general when the deadline gets close. Those are the indicators that told you what was happening in April 2025, while the official statements were still calm. And if you want the single sentence to carry out of this video, it is the one the analysts kept repeating and the headlines kept ignoring. This was a tactical truce, not a strategic shift. The tariffs came down, the escalation was paused, and the switch stayed exactly where it was, in the same hand with a calendar reminder set for November.